In Kakariko Village there is a well that goes down deep. At its base, a path that once was not, now is. A space large enough that you can squeeze yourself through ancient slabs that zig and zag until you come across a space. Enveloped by cavernous walls and under the warm glow of bright bloom seed, a modest vegetable patch grows. A diary spread open offers up hopes for the future and a few recipe ideas. They sound pretty good, a rare treat to enjoy on a mellow night under the stars. This was someone's sanctuary, and maybe it still is. A microscopic world within a world within a world that brought home the sorrowful unimportance of the big things that were going on outside. Because when you feel so powerless against the darkness, against the expanse, against the full weight of the world, you turn to small pleasures to keep you going. A cozy little cubbyhole, some good food, the company of those you love. There is nothing more potent in this realm or the next than the will to maintain normalcy while everything around you burns. Tears of the Kingdom has moments like these that can be counted in the hundreds. Dioramic details spread generously across its familiar lands, warm reminders that life must go on no matter how many times the blood moon rises. It is these moments I think about most fondly when I look back on my time with the game. Great care and artistry has gone into ensuring the robust pleasures of little things can be found around every corner. That attention to detail, to me, is akin to godliness, a whole lifetime of souls poured unctuously into these cute little objects. Every space, every room, every moment a monument to the artistic fire of those who put brush to canvas. They did it again. Those magnificent bastards, they made me fall in love with the intimacy of this vast, ambitious world. It's just a shame I don't really like the game built around it. It was always going to be a tough sell. The sophomore follow-up to what I and many others consider to be a masterpiece. Astonished as I was when I first got my hands on it, Breath of the Wild really was that good. And what truly made it sing was that its sheer vastness was accompanied by a devastatingly laser-focused design that boomeranged every aspect of the game back around into its singular goal. But what Breath of the Wild did in the peripheries was perhaps equally as enthralling. It presented this post-collapse world as one whose denizens were far from crushed under the burden of the big things going on around them. There were dozens of micro-stories littered around the edges of the map, characters obviously unnerved by the century-old malignance at the kingdom's center, but having their own things going on that were, to them, more important. It was these little foibles that really brought Hyrule to life and rendered clearly what was at stake. It's no surprise then that Tears of the Kingdom's continuation of these ancillary narratives has ended up being my favourite part of the game. It's more of what I like. Bespoke vignettes that tie neatly into the systemic design of the world, smaller quests that do well to highlight the vastness of the land and the coziness of the lives within it. Moment to moment, Tears of the Kingdom is a thing of joy. But when I think about the game as a complete execution of an idea, well, that's another story altogether. Burdened by the expectation of being the follow-up to the quote-unquote greatest game of all time, Tears of the Kingdom is an experience I feel is let down by its kitchen sink approach to design, hampering its font of creativity with a reluctance to let go of the past and an insistence on leaving no materials to waste. For every new idea it musters, you reach it along the carcasses of a dozen way too familiar ones, creating something that, to me, feels like a diminished version of a game I have already played. Not lacking, but rather suffocated by abundance. It started, rather surprisingly, at the very beginning. After a nice, succinct opening that established the stakes once again, you awaken in the ruins of a sky kingdom. It's a beautiful vista, almost painterly in quality. Warm summer colours, a marriage of the organic and the mechanical that is so very reminiscent of Laputa Castle in the Sky. Lots of lovely verticality, things stacked on top of and underneath land masses, a new paradise to bound and skip and rummage your way through. And then you're asked to complete a small selection of shrines, designed to familiarise yourself with the core mechanics of the game, each one presenting you with a new power, and only after completing them all can you gain access to the rest of the world. It's another tutorial island. I appreciate that it may seem nitpicky to complain about a game utilising what is a very good way to familiarise a player with a setting and its rules, but my heart truly sank when I realised that this was almost verbatim the Great Plateau, down even to the environmental extremes and drip feeding of abilities. Not a big sticking point admittedly, but it allowed the thought to creep into my mind, is the rest of the game going to follow the same beats of Breath of the Wild this egregiously? I got over it quite quickly. The new mechanics are a lot of fun in this opening area, building machines and sky rails and all manner of DIY solutions to more complex navigation puzzles. It's a bit fiddly at first, but there's a nice balance between complexity and a sort of throwaway essence to this system that means that great ideas are rewarded, but failures rarely have so potent a sting. In the isolated kingdom beyond the clouds, the Ultra Hand, as it's called, really makes sense. All of its composite powers do. Building bridges, fusing materials together, swimming up through solid rock and earth. It's a comprehensive language set that operates in the absence of other things like the paraglider or those previous Sheikah Slate abilities. This aerial archipelago is the perfect opening for the game Tears of the Kingdom initially presents itself as. A virtual playground to navigate and explore, with a toolset designed explicitly around the space it's created for. There's a brilliant push-pull between targeted design and out-of-the-box thinking that becomes a microcosm of this sequel's greatest ideas. But it's an elation that quickly falls flat. Once your head is dragged unceremoniously from the clouds and you plummet to the earth, the real work begins, and once again the detriment of diminishing returns rears its ugly head. You meet old friends. You establish, rather weakly I might add, the stakes of this adventure. You're sent to each corner of the map to investigate various meteorological goings-on. My fears came back once again. It really did seem like those same beats were being vigorously drummed. It doesn't help that the game's main quests do little to deviate from its predecessor. You move towards 4 regions, all plagued with their own problems, and you discover and tackle dungeons that really aren't all that dissimilar to the Divine Beasts. If anything, these spaces are even less dynamic, have fewer moving parts. Then you fight a boss, gain a heart container, a magical MacGuffin that grants you a new power, and an ally comes to the end of their own personal journey of discovery. Then it's back to the drawing board to do it all again. It does little to inspire, and I think the fact that these dungeons mostly follow the same do one thing several times to unlock the boss format makes them feel infinitely smaller than they otherwise would. This may all be new content, but it feels much more like a palette swap than something as tangibly different as the new mechanics. The issue with utilising the shape and structure of Breath of the Wild is not so much that it's just doing the same thing again, but rather that it doesn't really make sense within this new framework. Where Breath of the Wild used mystery to strengthen resolve, in Tears of the Kingdom it feels a lot like the opposite. For the longest time I really wasn't quite sure where any of my goals were leading to. I knew I'd have to fight Ganondorf eventually. It's a Zelda game, they're hardly groundbreaking in that sense, but there were oddities that seemed designed to lead you astray. The sightings of Zelda across Hyrule, unearthing the enigmatic history of the Zonai, the hill figures that uncover snapshots of the past. At times it feels like Tears of the Kingdom really wanted to be akin to games like Outer Wilds, an experience where unearthing the truth and the true goal of the game was part and parcel of learning its systems and mechanics. Only it doesn't really do this at all. Revelations are handed to you rather haphazardly, the red herrings never amount to more than just that. Playing the entirety of this game is such a disjointed experience, one that feels like it's tugging at your lapels every which way the wind blows. As a result, every victory feels that little bit muted, every mission complete a hollow charge towards the next one with no real sense of what end is in sight. And when you do finally figure out the answer was right under your feet this whole time, that aha moment feels a lot less earned than your previous venture did. It is perhaps here that the crux of all my problems with the game is most apparent. It feels like 3 games mashed together incoherently. One is Breath of the Wild 2, all the familiarity of that previous game with a bit of a facelift and a few new enemies to keep you guessing. Another is Tears of the Kingdom, a game about building janky contraptions to overcome obstacles and navigate spaces hostile to the player. The third is this sort of faux mystery adventure game I was talking about, Outer Wilds Light, that in this context doesn't really quite work specifically because it cannot commit to any one thing it's trying to achieve. One game. 3 games. A selection of good ideas laced together clumsily and then lacquered to within an inch of its life. Tears of the Kingdom is an exercise in grasping to comprehend an out-of-focus bigger picture. Every individual component feels like a compromised version of a more interesting concept. In any case, it's a lamentation of how this impacts the things I really do genuinely love about the game. A collection of really neat little moments that take way better advantage of what the game has to offer than the experience as a whole does. But finding a foothold for these little moments is a difficult task. Understanding the context of why they matter is drowned out by this sense that it's not just 3 games rolled into one, but 3 worlds too. The struggle to connect the dots between the past, present, and the future is admittedly more potent in some places than other, but for a lot of this game's return to Hyrule, I got the impression that folding new creases into old fabric was perhaps a task too Sisyphean, even for a studio with a pedigree as good as Nintendo EPD. Part of this frustration comes from the fact that we've already seen this done much better before, a follow-up to a much lauded adventure featuring an iconic lead that uses old assets and new mechanics to provide a haunting and emotional deconstruction of that previous jaunt. That's right, baby, I'm talking about Final Fantasy X2.
YRP. In position. It's showtime, girls.
Like Square Enix's powerfully divisive direct sequel, Tears of the Kingdom's vision of Hyrule is designed to coalesce the twin identities of the familiar and the unknown, returning to places you have history with to discover that everything has changed, or in some cases rather heartbreakingly, stayed the same. In this cognitive space, X2 uses its setting, Spira, to explore a more freeform story, one built around the discovery of older histories unearthed in the wake of the Eternal Calm. The world has changed fundamentally, the old religious governing body undone and annihilated by the outing of the truth. In its place, warring factions reign supreme. Having been emancipated from the not quite so uniting threat of sin, the people of Spira find themselves at a loss as to what is the best way to govern. Saving the world, as it turns out, did not save the world. Underneath the cheesy but ultimately endearing girl power brand, what the game is as itself and as a follow-up to an established fable is something that teeters perfectly on the edge of these two ideas. The game space is familiar, designed to evoke very particular memories of your time embarking on that world-weary pilgrimage. Your bond with those spaces, what you end up doing within them, and how the relationship dynamics of your friends and loved ones has changed so much over time allows the game to feel brand new, like you're seeing this world through someone else's eyes. And if you've played this game, you'll know that that's a most deliciously apt analogy. While I would argue almost to the death that X2 is a masterful metamorphosis of an original idea into something fundamentally different, Tears of the Kingdom suffers in this respect. Because the change is incremental rather than fundamental, the form of the world isn't really all that different, even though it's almost tripled in size. The way you interact with it is broadly the same in spite of the new language set. You get your paraglider back almost immediately. The shrines may look different, but they offer the same kinds of experience as those that came before. Weapon degradation is back with a new twist to soften the blow, but the folk who really did not like it before are definitely still not going to like it now. As much as I've found myself enjoying the Breath of the Wild 2 elements more than anything else, the gentle exploration, the seemingly flippant and unimportant questing, the sense of invitation that comes from revisiting old homes and finding them unrecognizable, I know in my heart that the game would be stronger without them. We didn't need to revisit this space like we did Spira or Kamurocho or any other game that builds its identity around its locales as much as it does its cast. To me, Hyrule has always been more of an idea than a tangible place, a means of expressing mechanics, encouraging the joy of play. In many ways, you, the player, are the central idea of the Zelda series, and as such it's hard to reconcile the need to return to Breath of the Wild's Hyrule in this way, garnering this uncomfortably paradoxical feeling that this is both a space my boots have already well worn, and also a landscape with no emotional connection to what I was doing in that previous game. The texture of that previous world was not substantive enough to demand this kind of re-evaluation. What are we even doing here that's so fundamentally different this time around? The political landscape doesn't seem to have changed. The relationship you have with the four factions, Rito, Goron, Zora, and Gerudo, is broadly the same. Yes, they are spending more time with one another rather than staring from afar, new mischiefs paired with familiar faces, and assorted weather fuck-ups germinating fresh challenges, but a new coat of paint, a more generous draw distance, and a few new assets do not a new world make. And I think another part of the problem is that Hyrule is just too bloody big. There's a strong argument to be made that the vastness of the landscape was the point in Breath of the Wild, to evoke a sense of intimidation, uncontrollable vistas for which navigation alone was a sense of triumph. While there was a great sense of verticality and depth to this world, it was always grounded in the physical limitations of the player, unless you buggered about with the game's physics, of course. As a result, even when you were soaring through the air, hanging for dear life to your paraglider, the world still retained a sense of mystery and wonder. In Tears of the Kingdom, fired greedily into the skies by one of the myriad launch sites that have come to replace those previous towers and ultimately do the same thing but in a less interesting way, the world is at the same time big and small. This landscape loses its shape quickly when viewed from up high. This is a problem. This version of Hyrule is a place that was built to facilitate a very specific kind of experience. It's not a space that can stand up to the level of scrutiny that this sequel insists upon. Putting new things above and below it does not change that fact, and instead warps what was already there in ways that are quite unflattering. The triangle rule that was the cornerstone of Breath of the Wild's world design goes out of the window the moment you increase the scope of your elevation. The world flattened, the friction mitigated. It's never been easier and less interesting to navigate this space, and it's all in aid of Tears of the Kingdom's most disappointing aspect. The Sky Islands. They're just not particularly good. After that amazing looking opening section, everything that follows feels like an afterthought, an extension of the context-specific challenges of the shrines that lack the robust sense of place that the rest of the world has. Their look from the ground does little to inspire, a random assortment of dots chased lazily across the sky, spaced too far apart to really take advantage of their spatial, vertical alignment, looking more like blemishes than awe-inspiring untamed wilds. I feel no great desire to explore this aerial space. When I do, quickly I see repetition in design and flat derivative atolls. I think were the map smaller, these spaces closer together, they would feel a lot more interconnected and enticing to explore, going from a faint outline of an idea to a robust, tangible space. The point of the experience, not just a fragment of it. Part of why they feel so watered down an idea is that they're either completely trivial to navigate or a total chore. I have no doubt that were the paraglider absent from this game, there would be riots in the streets. It's an essential part of the game's toolkit, but it also gets in the way of players finding more interesting ways to navigate the skies. You can build planes, for Christ's sake, but why would you when the traditional way is quicker and easier? Especially once you unlock Tulin's sage ability to summon gusts of wind that fling you forward, it's a no-brainer. There's a second component to this too. As above, so below. Deep in the bowels of the earth, far beyond those lovely intimate spaces to discover, is a land of darkness and rot. The depths is incredible the first time you lay your eyes on it. A proper shit-your-pants moment as you sink into the infinite pitch black and realise you'll eventually have to explore this godforsaken realm. You hope to Christ that you've packed enough bright bloom seeds and that you have the good sense to avoid a lot of the real nasties that slink about in the dark, because otherwise you exist a monument to the frailty of solitude. It's a brilliantly powerful moment that takes away everything the player has come to expect from the game and the series' legacy. Your body at the mercy of the gloom, the expectations of your tools and combat prowess forced to reset to such a dread-inducing degree that at first it really does feel like you've suffered a fate worse than death. But once again, the issue of scope rears its ugly head. Part of what initially made the depths so thrilling to explore was not knowing how far it reached. The sea of black that awaits you taps into the great fear of the unknown. However, with enough time exploring the surface and with those gloom-ridden chasms appearing rather unsubtly on the overworld map, it becomes very easy to clock that it's basically the size of Hyrule itself. That sense of nervousness goes away almost immediately. Yes, that is a vast space to navigate, but it's a finite one. When you understand the boundaries, you recognise also that there's a limit to what awaits you. It feels very unfortunate to have discovered this so early into the game rather than in its twilight hours. What you're left with is a landmass that has no stunning vistas to keep you exploring, is a bit of a chore to navigate, and is full of identikit encounters and repeated landmarks. The light routes became much more that maligned box-ticking radio tower put there only to illuminate without any resistance. The gloom is ultimately a nuisance obstacle put there to prevent you from getting smoothly from A to B. What awaits you in the depths is mostly more annoying versions of the foes you face on the surface. In a realm chock full of repetitive experiences, this is the prime offender. The cruelest fate for a good idea is the refusal to let it come to its natural conclusion. Once again, it does a disservice to the actually interesting mechanics that are born from this initial encounter with the deep. Impossible blackness, evaporated horizons, hazards that sap your maximum health, and creatures born of nightmares hidden in the haze. In a more condensed, more dangerous version of this environment, one where escape wasn't so simple as the press of a button, this would have been brilliant. As it stands, it's volume over quality, and as a result, it's not good. Something it's taken me a while to come to terms with when thinking about these disparate factions of an incohesive world is that the USP designed to tie it all together, the creation toolkit that is the Ultra Hand, is designed in a way that makes it often very frustrating to use. The throwaway nature of it works well for its direct application as a component of puzzle solving and temporary navigation, but the moment you start getting ambitious, you start to run amok of its limitations. Your contraptions disappear at the blink of an eye. The unique component parts are subject to a gacha-style lottery that feels very at odds with the freedom of the game, not to mention just looking very out of place in the world itself. While you can hold certain items in your inventory, the moment you take them out, they belong to the world, and the moment you leave, they are lost to oblivion. I appreciate that these limitations are most likely a necessity to maintain a stable game state. Lord knows we've seen firsthand how easily game engines can fall apart at the slightest provocation. I played the PS3 version of Skyrim. If you know, you know. It is a masterwork that everything in Tears of the Kingdom works the way it's intended with minimal flaws, but the consequence of this is that the game's most interesting idea is seldom used to play it. I found myself going hours at a time adventuring as though the Ultra Hand did not exist, simply because the other systems in play were more robust, easier to use, and often way more effective. Once again, it boils down to the fact that this game world has been retrofitted for these new means of play, not designed around them. It gives you this bountiful toolkit for player expression, then demands that you meet it on its own terms to use it. For all the praise Nintendo gets for their mechanics-first approach, this feels more like an afterthought, albeit one worked on for years and polished to within an inch of its life. And it's annoying because this system is incredibly good. To an almost objective degree, it's the best thing that this game is doing. Yes, I know Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts did it first, but you can't really play that game on the toilet, can you? I wanted to start this video with some positive thoughts because despite all my frustrations, I do still really like this game. Every time I've sat down and turned on my Switch, I've found at least one nice thing to take away from it. The formula still holds up extremely well. The world is still for the most part really fun to navigate, especially with these new tools at your disposal. I still get a flutter in my heart whenever a Skyview tower shoots me up into the stratosphere, bursting through the clouds to gaze upon the bounty of the three goddesses, even if logic dictates that this doesn't gel well with the world's original design. The new enemies add a much needed texture to the combat experience, given that the new powers don't particularly have any direct conflict application beyond fusing materials to your weapons. Returning favourites and new twists on old nightmares, there's some really nasty surprises awaiting you in this land. When I tell you I jumped out of my skin the first time I went to pick an apple off a tree and it started fighting back, well, let's just say I've taken a more cautious approach to scrumping from now on. Games like these are, amongst everything else, a collection of moments, and the moments in this game are often really special. But sadly, as often is the cost of Horizons, there's a hell of a lot of repetition going on. That opening anecdote, the vegetable patch under the well, there are 57 other such versions of this experience. It was just the first one I encountered, so it's the one that's stuck in my mind. There are 81 renditions of helping an absolute buffoon hold a sign up, 120 light routes in the depths, 152 shrines on land and sky, 1,000 bloody Korok seeds all over the place, not to mention the good half-dozen different currencies you need to keep track of for upgrades and new equipment. Like Breath of the Wild, you don't need to do it all. It's mainly put there to ensure that every player has enough to put them in good steads for the challenges that await them, but it still pains me to take a glance at some of these things and know exactly what I'm expected to do. It's like seeing the Matrix. It teaches you early on to avoid the things that are definitely going to be a pain in the ass to complete, like those Sky Crystal Shrine challenges, even when those might end up being the most mechanically interesting bits of the game. When the space is this vast, some poor bugger has to fill it, and variation will only get you so far. We saw the same issue in Elden Ring, a game chock full of brilliant moments that unfortunately seem to come around more than once the further you progress. Reused assets is one thing. There are plenty of examples out there of drawing something new out of old materials, but reused experiences is not something you can hide so easily. In spite of all this, I'm grateful that my time with this game hasn't diminished my love for Breath of the Wild. I've seen a lot of the initial responses to Tears of the Kingdom laud it for making its predecessor seem quaint by comparison, some even arguing it now obsolete, which is a funny thing to say about a sequel, especially one that's a direct continuation of the composition, narrative and essence of that 2017 game. It's a strange thing to say about any work of media, really. What is the goal of a sequel? I don't know that I have an answer for this question, but I certainly don't think it's to attack and dethrone that which came before, a sort of hyper-aggressive Oedipal connection to the past in which all things succumb to entropy, even ideas. Some might argue that expanse and escalation are expected, that anything that follows a creation has to be bigger and better, that the point of a sequel is to shatter the boundaries of the frame, but I strongly feel that there's something very wrong with the folk who think of art in these terms. It's like arguing which is the best Final Fantasy. It doesn't matter. They aren't in competition with each other. It's whichever one you like. Tears of the Kingdom, in many ways, is the only sequel we could have got. It's the Assassin's Creed 2 of the series, the Far Cry 3, the Arkham City, the Wild Hunt. As conventional a sequel as we could have got, escalated, improved, but inevitably tethered to the past. Beyond the bloat, the repetition, and those returns most diminished, however, lies an open and honest blueprint for a game that often revels in its creativity, for which it most solemnly must be lauded. Cursed by expectation, with the impossible task of following up a paradigm-shifting cultural behemoth, it's a game that will always exist beyond its own capacity for self-reverence. It exists in communication with its ancestors, in discourse with modern gaming idioms. It wants to be every version of Zelda without understanding that the differences are what made those other games so special. Maybe it's time to move that conversation on. Tears of the Kingdom has been a complicated game to get my head around, and in writing about it I have succumbed somewhat to its delusions of grandeur. This video is a lot, I know, bigger and more winding than what I normally produce, but I would not spend so much time thinking about what it gets wrong if I didn't think it worthy of such discourse in the first place. And with time, once the dust has settled, the king of the Gerudos lain to rest, the land restored once more, all those quirks, frustrations and lamentations will eventually fade, and what I will remember is how it made me feel to discover, in Kakariko Village, that vegetable patch under the well.